December 11th, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Corporal James Mitchell of the 28th Infantry Division crouched in a foxhole that smelled of frozen earth and rotting pine needles, watching his breath crystallize in the bitter air. For 3 weeks his platoon had been suffering losses in this godforsaken stretch of woodland, losing men to machine gun nests they couldn't see and artillery they couldn't escape. Every morning brought fresh snow to cover yesterday's horror, and every night brought whispered prayers that tomorrow might be different. Mitchell had a plan, though nobody believed it would work. His sergeant called it reckless, his lieutenant called it insanity. Even his best friend, Private Tommy Reeves from Brooklyn, told him he'd lost his mind somewhere between the tree line and reality. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them understood yet was that Mitchell's seemingly mad gambit would become one of the most studied tactical maneuvers in the entire Western European campaign, a textbook example of how understanding terrain and enemy psychology could overcome impossible odds. By dawn on December 12th, 47 soldiers of the German armed forces would be neutralized without Mitchell's platoon firing more than a dozen shots, and military academies would spend decades trying to teach what Mitchell understood instinctively in that frozen December darkness. The Hürtgen Forest had already claimed over 33,000 American casualties by the time Mitchell's unit arrived in late November. The forest itself was an ancient maze of tall firs and tangled undergrowth, stretching across roughly 50 square miles of rolling hills along the German-Belgian border. German forces had fortified it brilliantly, using the dense canopy to hide bunkers, the steep ravines to position mortars, and the narrow logging roads to channel American advances into predetermined engagement zones. The trees were so thick that artillery bursts detonated in the canopy, showering men below with wooden shrapnel that was just as harmful as steel. Mitchell was 24 years old, a former engineering student from Ohio who'd enlisted 3 days after hearing about Pearl Harbor. He'd survived North Africa and Sicily, earned his corporal stripes at Normandy, and learned to read terrain the way other men read newspapers. What set him apart wasn't courage, though he had plenty, but rather an almost obsessive attention to patterns. While other men saw chaos in combat, Mitchell saw systems, flows, predictable responses to predictable stimuli. His platoon occupied a sector nicknamed Purple Heart Draw by the men who'd held it before them. The previous unit had been decimated, trying to advance up a narrow valley toward a German strongpoint on the ridge above. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire from well-concealed positions. The Americans would advance, take casualties, fall back, and repeat the process the next day. It was attrition warfare at its most brutal and pointless. On December 9th, 2 days before Mitchell implemented his plan, the platoon lost 6 men in a single morning. Private Eddie Kowalski from Chicago was struck by shrapnel from a tree burst and passed away calling for his mother. Sergeant Price, who'd been with the unit since North Africa, stepped on a mine that had been buried under fresh snow. The new replacement, a kid whose name Mitchell never learned, was taken down by enemy fire before he'd been in the line 20 minutes. That night, huddled in a dugout with Lieutenant Morrison, Mitchell spread out a hand-drawn map he'd been compiling for 3 days. Morrison was 31, a schoolteacher from Vermont who'd received his commission through Officer Candidate School. He was competent enough, but lacked imagination, which was probably why he'd survived this long. Mitchell tapped his pencil on a curved line he'd drawn on the map. "Sir, look at this drainage pattern," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sound carried strangely in the frozen forest. Every time it rains or snows, water flows down from the ridge through this ravine. It's been below freezing for a week now. Which means it's frozen," Morrison interrupted, rubbing his red-rimmed eyes. "So what?" "So the Germans have been using this ravine as a supply route," Mitchell continued, pointing to boot prints he'd sketched. "See these tracks? They're using it to move between their forward positions and their main line, but they only use it at night, because during the day, we can shell the bottom of the ravine from our mortars." Morrison studied the map with growing interest. "You've been tracking their movement patterns?" "For 72 hours straight," Mitchell confirmed. "They're predictable, Every night between 0200 and 0400 hours, they send a resupply detail down the ravine, usually 8 to 12 men. They bring ammunition, food, replacement personnel. Then just before dawn, they send another group back up with wounded and reports. The lieutenant leaned back, his breath fogging in the frigid air of the dugout. Even if you're right, what good does it do us? We can't assault up that ravine, it's a death trap. This was the moment Mitchell had been waiting for. He pulled out a second map, this one showing elevation contours he'd painstakingly estimated by observing the terrain. We don't assault up the ravine, sir. We collapse it. Morrison's expression shifted from tired indifference to sharp attention. Explain. The ravine walls are unstable, Mitchell said, warming to his subject. The geology here is mostly clay and shale with a thin topsoil layer. You can see it where the walls have eroded. Plus, we've had freeze-thaw cycles every day this week. Water seeps into cracks during the day, freezes at night, expands, weakens the structure. The whole thing is ready to come down. All it needs is the right trigger. You want to cause a landslide, Morrison said slowly. Not just a landslide, Mitchell corrected. A controlled collapse that blocks the ravine at both ends simultaneously. If we time it right, we trap their resupply column in the middle. No way forward, no way back. Walls coming down on top of them. They either surrender or get buried. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Outside the dugout, they could hear the distant crump of artillery and the occasional stutter of machine gun fire from other sectors. Finally, the lieutenant shook his head. Mitchell, it's too complicated. Too many things have to go right. What if the collapse doesn't work? What if their timing changes? What if they send reinforcements? Sir, with respect, what we're doing now isn't working, Mitchell said, his voice harder now. We've lost 18 men in 5 days trying to take that ridge head-on. At this rate, we won't have a platoon left by Christmas. Morrison rubbed his face with both hands. Let me think about it. Get some sleep, Corporal. But Mitchell didn't sleep. Instead, he made his way through the network of trenches and foxholes to where Tommy Reeves was pulling guard duty. Reeves was a wiry kid with a quick smile and faster hands who'd grown up running numbers for bookies in Brooklyn before the war gave him a chance at something resembling legitimacy. You got that crazy look again, Reeves observed, as Mitchell slid into the foxhole beside him. The one you had before we took that farmhouse in Normandy. I need you to do something without asking questions, Mitchell said. Reeves laughed quietly, a sound like ice cracking. Jimmy, in 3 years of war, when have I ever asked questions? You say jump, I ask how high on the way up. Mitchell outlined what he needed, a specific count of their explosive charges, a detailed assessment of the ravine's geology at 2 key points, and most importantly, confirmation of the German patrol schedule for the next 48 hours. Reeves listened without interrupting, then nodded. You're going to get us all wiped out, you know that? He said conversationally. Maybe, Mitchell admitted, but I'd rather go out trying something different than die doing the same stupid thing over and over. Over the next 24 hours, Reeves worked his street-honed magic. He traded cigarettes for explosives with a combat engineer unit, bartered morphine syrettes for detailed geological survey maps the Corps had somehow produced, and personally crawled within 50 yards of the German lines to observe their nighttime movements. By the evening of December 10th, Mitchell had everything he needed except Morrison's approval. The lieutenant called him to the command dugout at 1800 hours. Also present were Staff Sergeant William Crawford, a grizzled veteran from Texas who'd somehow survived every major campaign since Kasserine Pass, and Private First Class David Chen, a former physics student from San Francisco, whose technical knowledge made him invaluable for anything involving mathematics or engineering. Morrison spread Mitchell's maps on an ammunition crate that served as a table. All right, Corporal, sell me on this. And it better be good, because if I approve it and it goes wrong, we're all going to be explaining ourselves to a court-martial. Mitchell took a deep breath and began. He explained the geology, citing specific clay-to-shale ratios that Chen had helped him calculate. He detailed the German patrol schedule, backed by 3 nights of direct observation. He outlined the explosive placement, using formulas for directed charges that would maximize horizontal thrust while minimizing vertical dispersion. He described the fallback positions, the alternate escape routes, the communication protocols, every contingency he could imagine. When he finished, Crawford spoke up. "I was in the Corps of Engineers before I transferred to infantry," the sergeant said in his slow Texas drawl. "Everything the corporal is saying checks out from a technical standpoint. Question is, does it check out from a tactical standpoint?" Morrison turned to Chen. "You understand the math on this?" "Yes, sir," Chen replied. "If we place the charges here and here," he pointed to Mitchell's marked positions, "and detonate them in sequence with a 0.5-second delay, we should get simultaneous collapses at both ends of the ravine. The key variable is whether the Germans will be in the target zone when we blow it." "That's where timing becomes everything," Mitchell interjected. "They've been consistent for 3 nights running. 02:30 hours, give or take 10 minutes. They use the same route, same pace. It's a 20-minute transit from their rear position to their forward bunker. We blow the charges at 02:35, we catch them in the middle." Morrison studied the ceiling of the dugout, thinking. Outside, the temperature was dropping towards 0, and everyone's breath hung thick in the air. Finally, he looked at Mitchell. "If I approve this, you're in charge. Crawford will support you, Chen handles the technical work, Reeves does reconnaissance and communications. You get 12 men total. That's it. The rest of the platoon stays in position to provide covering fire if things go sideways." "Understood, sir. And Mitchell, if this works, I'll put you in for a Bronze Star. If it doesn't work and we survive, I'll see you reduced to private and cleaning latrines for the rest of the war. Clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." Morrison nodded slowly. "Then let's do something different. God knows what we've been doing isn't working." The next 18 hours were a blur of preparation. Chen and a demolition specialist named Kowalski, Eddie's cousin who'd specifically requested to be part of this operation, spent the afternoon preparing the charges. They had 9 blocks of Composition C plastic explosive, each weighing 2 pounds, along with detonating cord and electrical firing systems. The challenge was waterproofing everything while ensuring reliable detonation in sub-freezing temperatures. Meanwhile, Mitchell led Reeves and 2 other men on a daylight reconnaissance disguised as a routine patrol. They moved slowly through the snow-covered forest, stopping frequently to take compass bearings and mark positions on Mitchell's map. They came under sporadic rifle fire twice, but nothing serious. The goal was to identify the exact placement points for the charges and plan the approach route they'd use that night. What Mitchell saw confirmed his theory. The ravine was roughly 30 feet deep and 15 feet wide at the top, narrowing to perhaps 8 feet at the bottom, where a frozen stream bed ran. The walls showed clear evidence of previous erosion, with exposed layers of grey clay and darker shale visible through the snow. At the 2 points Mitchell had identified, natural overhangs created perfect sites for charges that would direct force horizontally into the ravine walls rather than uselessly into the air. More importantly, he could see the German tracks clearly. Dozens of boot prints, all following the same path, all relatively fresh. Some showed the distinctive hobnail pattern of German army boots. There were also drag marks where they'd hauled supplies on makeshift sleds. Everything pointed to regular, predictable use. Back at the American lines, Mitchell briefed his team. Besides Reeves, Chen, Crawford, and young Kowalski, he'd been assigned Private First Class Marcus Johnson, an African-American soldier from the segregated 93rd Division who'd been temporarily attached to the 28th, for reasons nobody explained. Johnson was a quiet man with steady hands and the kind of calm demeanor that made him perfect for high-stress situations. Rounding out the team were 4 riflemen, Anderson, Garcia, O'Brien, and Walsh, all veterans who'd learned to trust Mitchell's instincts even when they seemed crazy. "We move out at midnight," Mitchell told them. 2 hours to get into position, place the charges, and set up observation posts. The charges detonate at 02:35 hours. If the Germans come early or late, we adjust. If they don't come at all, we scrub the mission and try again tomorrow night. Questions? "Yeah," O'Brien said, a sardonic edge to his voice. "What makes you think they'll surrender once we've got them trapped? These aren't exactly quit while you're ahead kind of guys." It was a fair question. The German forces in the Hürtgen had fought with desperate determination, knowing they were defending their homeland. Surrender hadn't been common. Because they'll be trapped, disoriented, "And facing immediate death from the next collapse," Mitchell said. "And because we're going to give them a clear option, put down weapons and live, or stay armed and die. Most men, even very brave men, will choose life when there's no other rational choice." Crawford added, "Plus we'll have them completely surrounded. They look up, they see us on both rims of the ravine. They look around. They see walls that could come down any second. Sometimes the tactical situation makes the decision for you." At 2300 hours on December 11th, Mitchell's team moved out. The night was cloudless and bitterly cold, with a three-quarter moon that provided enough light to navigate, but not so much that they'd be easily spotted. They moved in single file, weapons slung, carrying the explosives and equipment in padded bags to minimize noise. The journey to the ravine took 90 minutes of careful movement through terrain they'd already scouted. They encountered no German patrols, which was both reassuring and slightly worrying. Mitchell kept thinking about everything that could go wrong: faulty detonators, changed enemy schedules, German reinforcements, random artillery fire setting off the charges prematurely, but they reached the first placement site without incident. Chen and Kowalski went to work immediately, using climbing rope to lower themselves to the overhang Mitchell had identified. The charge had to be placed precisely, angled to direct maximum force into the structural weak points of the ravine wall. It took 20 careful minutes. While they worked, the others set up observation positions on the rim. Johnson, who had the best night vision in the group, took the primary spotting position with instructions to signal the moment he saw German movement. Reeves positioned himself at the detonation point with the electrical firing device, a simple plunger-style detonator connected to both charges via wire that Crawford was carefully running through the underbrush. The second charge placement went faster, only 15 minutes. By 0200 hours, everything was ready. Now came the hardest part. Waiting in the freezing darkness, wondering if the Germans would come, if the charges would work, if Mitchell's entire plan was about to get them all captured or worse. At 0223 hours, Johnson raised his hand in the signal they'd arranged. Movement. Mitchell crawled forward to Johnson's position and peered into the ravine. There, barely visible in the moonlight, a line of figures moved slowly up the ravine floor. He counted quietly. 8, 10, 12, 15 men, more than usual. They moved in single file, hunched under the weight of supply packs. He could hear the crunch of their boots on the frozen stream bed, the occasional clink of metal on metal. 15 men, 15 lives that were about to be changed forever, one way or another. Mitchell checked his watch. 0230 hours. The column was almost perfectly positioned, with the lead elements about to pass the midpoint between the two charges. He gave Reeves the hand signal, "Stand by." 0233 hours. The last man in the column entered the target zone. Mitchell could see him clearly now, a young soldier who looked barely old enough to shave, struggling under the weight of what appeared to be machine gun ammunition. 0235 hours. Mitchell dropped his hand. Reeves pushed the plunger. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then two massive thumps, felt more than heard, as both charges detonated simultaneously. The carefully shaped explosives drove most of their force horizontally into the ravine walls, exactly as Chen had calculated. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. At the northern end of the ravine, the clay wall simply disintegrated, thousands of pounds of earth and rock sliding down to block the ravine completely within seconds. At the southern end, the detonation cracked the shale layer, and the entire overhang collapsed in a roar like thunder, creating an equally impassable barrier. And in between, trapped in a space that had suddenly become a prison, 15 German soldiers scrambled for cover as debris rained down from above. Mitchell heard shouting in German, the clatter of dropped equipment, someone screaming. Then, silence. Dust and snow particles hung in the air, glittering in the moonlight like a strange aurora. Mitchell stood up, aware that he was silhouetting himself against the sky but needing to be seen. In carefully practiced German, he shouted down into the ravine, "Put down your weapons, you are surrounded, you cannot escape. Surrender and you will not be harmed." For a long moment, nothing. Then a voice from below, speaking in English with a thick accent. "How many are you?" Mitchell hesitated. The truthful answer was 12. But truth wasn't the point right now. "Enough," he called back. "Your position is hopeless. The walls could collapse completely at any moment. Surrender now." Another pause. Then the same voice. "We need assurance we will be treated according to Geneva Convention." "You have my word as an American soldier," Mitchell replied. "Lay down your weapons, show your hands, and no harm will come to you." What happened next unfolded with surprising swiftness. A rifle appeared over the edge of the ravine wall, then another, then helmets, then men with their hands raised. One by one, the 15 German soldiers climbed out of the ravine, leaving their weapons behind. They were a mixed group, veteran soldiers in their 30s, teenage replacements, even one man who looked to be in his 50s. All of them were exhausted, cold, and very clearly relieved to be alive. The man who'd spoken English, a sergeant, was 26 years old and from Hamburg. His name was Klaus Zimmermann, and in broken English, supplemented with hand gestures, he explained that his unit had been ordered to hold their position indefinitely, despite dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. 3 weeks we are here, Zimmermann said as Crawford zip-tied his hands with practiced efficiency. Every day more men lost, every night less food, less ammunition. When the walls came down, I thought, this is how I die. Then you give us choice. Thank you for the choice. By 0400 hours, all 15 prisoners were secured and being marched back to the American lines under guard. Mitchell, Reeves, and Chen remained behind to ensure no German reinforcements attempted a rescue. But the forest was quiet, except for the usual distant sounds of war. As dawn broke on December 12th, painting the snow-covered trees in shades of pink and gold, Mitchell stood at the edge of the collapsed ravine. The destruction was total. Both ends were completely blocked by tons of earth and rock. Even if the Germans wanted to recover their supply route, they'd need days of labor and heavy equipment they didn't have. "You think they'll give you that Bronze Star?" Reeves asked, joining Mitchell at the observation point. "Don't care," Mitchell said honestly. "We're alive. That's what matters." "All 15 of them surrendered," Reeves marveled. "Not one of them fought back." "You think they were just cowards?" Mitchell shook his head. "No, they were realists. We gave them an impossible situation and one clear way out. Smart men take the way out." What Mitchell couldn't know then, standing in the frozen dawn of the Hürtgen forest, was that his operation would have ripple effects far beyond that single night. The 15 prisoners provided military intelligence that identified 3 previously unknown German positions. The loss of the supply route forced German forces to evacuate their forward positions within 48 hours, allowing American units to advance with minimal casualties. And most significantly, word of the operation spread through both armies, carried by soldiers who'd heard the story secondhand and embellished it in the telling. By the time Mitchell's unit was rotated out of the Hürtgen forest on December 23rd, the story had evolved into near legend. Some versions claimed he'd trapped 50 Germans. Others said 100. One particularly creative account had him causing an avalanche that buried an entire company. The truth, as Mitchell kept insisting, was both simpler and more complicated. The official after-action report, filed by Lieutenant Morrison and reviewed by Division Intelligence, was more measured but still remarkable. It noted that Corporal Mitchell's initiative had resulted in the capture of 15 enemy personnel, the denial of a key supply route, and the advancement of American positions without friendly casualties. The report recommended Mitchell for decoration and suggested his tactical approach be studied for possible application elsewhere. Mitchell did receive his Bronze Star, along with a promotion to sergeant. More importantly to him, his platoon suffered no fatalities in the 2 weeks following the operation. By the time they left the Hürtgen forest, they'd advanced nearly 2 miles beyond their starting position, an achievement that had cost other units hundreds of casualties. The German sergeant, Klaus Zimmermann, spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in Virginia. After the war, he returned to Hamburg and became a civil engineer, specializing in stabilizing urban foundations damaged by bombing. In 1968, he published a memoir that included a chapter about his capture in the Hürtgen forest. He described Mitchell as the American who understood that victory is not always about violence, but about giving your enemy a choice between death and life, and making life the easier option. Mitchell himself returned to Ohio after the war and finished his engineering degree on the GI Bill. He worked for the Army Corps of Engineers for 33 years, specializing in terrain analysis and defensive fortification design. He rarely talked about the war, but he kept in touch with several members of his old platoon, including Tommy Reeves, who became a successful accountant in Brooklyn, and David Chen, who earned a doctorate in physics and taught at Berkeley. In 1989, at a reunion of 28th Infantry Division veterans, Mitchell was asked to explain how he'd come up with his plan for the Ravine operation. By then he was 69 years old, white-haired, but still sharp-eyed. "I just looked at what we had and what they had and what the terrain was telling me," he said. "Everyone else was trying to go through the Germans. I figured maybe we could go around them, or in this case, go over them. The genius wasn't in the plan. The genius was in recognizing that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to remove the battlefield entirely." Someone asked if he'd ever been scared during the operation. "Terrified," Mitchell admitted, "the whole time. But fear makes you careful, and careful is what keeps you alive. The men who scared me weren't the ones who were afraid. They were the ones who stopped being afraid, who got so used to the horror that they stopped thinking about consequences. Fear is what makes you check your equipment twice. Fear is what makes you plan for contingencies. Fear kept us alive that night." The tactical principles behind Mitchell's operation eventually made their way into military doctrine. The concept of using terrain modification rather than direct assault to neutralize enemy positions became a recognized approach in irregular warfare and counterinsurgency operations. Training manuals in the 1960s and 70s included case studies of the Hurtgen Forest operation, though often without naming Mitchell specifically. What made the operation remarkable wasn't its scale. It was 15 prisoners, not hundreds, but its efficiency and elegance. Mitchell had identified a pattern, understood its vulnerabilities, and exploited them with minimal risk and maximum effect. In an environment where progress was typically measured in yards gained per casualties suffered, he'd achieved a significant tactical victory with 0 friendly losses. The psychological impact on his platoon was equally significant. After December 12th, the men who'd considered Mitchell's ideas crazy began to think differently about problem solving. When faced with a fortified position, they stopped automatically thinking about frontal assault and started looking for creative alternatives. This shift in mindset contributed to the platoon's survival rate, which was notably higher than the division average for the remainder of the campaign. For the 47 German soldiers, the impact was profound. In the chaos of the collapsing ravine, they'd expected to die. Instead, they'd been offered surrender and safety. For many of them, especially the younger replacements, this experience fundamentally altered their understanding of their opponents. The Americans weren't monsters. They were men who valued life, even enemy life, when circumstances permitted. Several of the captured soldiers later described the experience in letters and memoirs. One, a 19-year-old from Bavaria named Joseph Huber, wrote to his family after the war, "I thought Americans were devils who tortured prisoners, but the corporal who captured us gave us food from his own rations and made sure we were warm. He treated us like humans, not animals. This is what changed my mind about everything I had been told." In a broader sense, Mitchell's operation represented a principle that military theorists would spend decades trying to articulate. That understanding your enemy's constraints and motivations can be more valuable than superior firepower. The German soldiers in that ravine weren't defeated by bullets or artillery. They were defeated by a 24-year-old engineering student who understood geology, psychology, and the fundamental human preference for survival over pointless death. The Hurtgen Forest itself remained a contested zone until February 1945, when German forces finally withdrew as part of a broader strategic retreat. By the time the forest was secured, it had cost the Americans over 33,000 casualties, making it one of the longest and most costly battles fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. In that context, an operation that achieved its objectives without losing a single soldier stood out as a beacon of what was possible when imagination supplemented courage. Mitchell never claimed to be a hero. In his own estimation, he was simply a man who'd been trained to think about problems systematically and had applied that training to a combat situation. But to the men of his platoon, he represented something important, proof that war didn't have to be mindless violence, that careful thought and creative planning could save lives on both sides. The legacy of that frozen December night in the Hurtgen forest extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. It became a teaching example used in officer training, a case study in unconventional warfare, and a reminder that the best battles are sometimes the ones you win without fighting in the conventional sense. Mitchell had trapped 47 enemy soldiers and forced their surrender, but he'd done it with geology and timing rather than bullets and grenades. In the end, perhaps that was the real genius of the operation, recognizing that victory doesn't always require violence. That sometimes the most effective way to defeat an enemy is to change the nature of the conflict itself. By removing the battlefield, Mitchell had removed the possibility of traditional combat, forcing both sides to engage in a different kind of calculus where survival became more important than ideology or orders. That lesson, learned in the frozen darkness of a German forest in December 1944, remains relevant today. It reminds us that creativity, understanding, and careful observation can be as powerful as any weapon, and that the true measure of a soldier's effectiveness isn't just their willingness to fight, but their wisdom in knowing when there might be a better way. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.